Mara Castellan did not apply to be a maid in a palace. She applied to be a translator's assistant for the Valkyrie trade delegation, a job that paid triple the standard Earth contract rate and required nothing more than a clean background check and a willingness to live off-world for 18 months. She had a linguistics degree she wasn't using, a mountain of student debt she was determined to bury, and a younger brother whose medical bills back home didn't care that she had principles about working for aliens. She found out the job had been reassigned only after she stepped off the shuttle on Velker Prime, when a thin, anxious-looking palace administrator named Seneth informed her that the translator position had been filled internally and that her contract had been quietly transferred to domestic service in the royal household instead. Mara almost turned around right there. Almost. But the pay was the same, the contract was binding either way, and Seneth looked so relieved when she didn't argue that she decided to see what 18 months of folding alien laundry might teach her. What it taught her, in the first week alone, was that the Valkyrie nobility did not see human staff as people so much as appliances that occasionally needed feeding. She was assigned to the personal household of Princess Iliane Voskeravet, third in line to a throne that, as far as Mara could tell, nobody particularly wanted, given how many of the people closer in line to it had died under circumstances everyone described as unfortunate and nobody described as accidental. The princess herself was 18 years old by Valkyrie reckoning, which Mara worked out was close enough to 19 in Earth years, and she carried herself with the brittle, overcorrected dignity of someone who had been taught from birth that any softness would be read as weakness by people who were actively looking for an excuse to remove her from the succession. She did not smile at the staff. She did not smile, period. In the 3 weeks Mara had been quietly cataloging the household's moods like a field researcher documenting an unfamiliar species. Mara's actual duties were unglamorous. She managed the princess's wardrobe, kept the private study organized, and ran errands between the residential wing and the kitchens that no Valkyrie servant wanted to run because the kitchens were 2 levels down and the lift was slow. It was during one of those errands, hauling a tray back up through a service corridor, that she first noticed Captain Rhys Dorn watching the princess in a way that didn't sit right. He wasn't watching her like a guard watches a principal, scanning the room, alert to exits and entrances. He was watching her like an accountant watches a number he's planning to adjust. Mara told herself she was imagining it. Rhys Dorn was the most decorated officer in the royal guard, personally selected by the king to shadow his daughter after the second assassination attempt on her elder brother. He had saved the princess's life once already, a fact mentioned so often by palace staff that it had become a kind of liturgy. Doubting him felt less like suspicion and more like blasphemy. But Mara had grown up in a neighborhood where you learned early to read a room, to clock who was watching the door and who was watching you, and 3 weeks into her posting she had developed an itch at the back of her neck every time Captain Dorn entered a space the princess occupied. She didn't say anything. She wasn't paid to have opinions about the royal guard. She was paid to keep the princess's blouses pressed and her tea at the correct temperature, and for a long while, that was exactly what she did. The first real conversation she had with Princess Iliane happened by accident, on a night when the princess couldn't sleep and wandered into the study to find Mara still there, finishing an inventory of the spring wardrobe a day ahead of schedule because she had nothing else to do with her evenings. The princess startled, then recovered with the brittle composure Mara had come to expect, and demanded to know why a human was in her study at this hour. "Finishing my work, Your Highness," Mara said. "I can come back." "No." The princess sat down across from her, uninvited, which Mara would later learn was itself strange, because Valkyrie royalty did not sit across from staff. "Stay. Talk to me about something that isn't politics." So Mara talked about Earth, about rain, about her brother's terrible taste in music, about nothing that mattered, and the princess listened with an attention that suggested nobody had spoken to her about nothing that mattered in a very long time. It became a habit. Not every night, but often enough that Mara began to understand the shape of the loneliness inside the dignity, the way a person can be surrounded by guards and ministers and still be entirely alone. It was during one of these conversations, weeks later, that the princess mentioned, almost as an aside, that Captain Dorn had suggested she reduce her public appearances for security reasons, just until the unrest surrounding the succession settled. Mara, who had spent the afternoon overhearing two guards in the corridor discuss overtime pay for an escort detail that didn't appear on the official schedule, felt the itch at the back of her neck turn into something colder. She didn't say anything that night either. She told herself it wasn't her place, that she was a maid with a translator's instincts and an overactive imagination, that the captain who had supposedly saved the princess's life once already had no reason to want her isolated unless isolation served some purpose Mara couldn't yet name. She was wrong about it not being her place. She just didn't know it yet. What she did know, lying awake in the narrow staff quarters that night, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling of a palace on a planet that wasn't hers, was that something in this household didn't add up, and that the only person paying close enough attention to notice was a human maid nobody in this palace had bothered to learn the name of. That was about to change. Not because Mara wanted recognition. She wanted, more than anything, for the small, sharp, lonely girl who sat across from her at night talking about rain to survive whatever was coming. And increasingly, Mara suspected that surviving it would not come from trusting the man in the polished armor standing at her door. It would come from someone watching the things he didn't want seen. The thing about being invisible, Mara had learned, was that people said things in front of you they would never say in front of each other. Valkyrie guards did not consider human domestic staff a security risk worth censoring themselves around, which meant that over the following month Mara collected a quiet, accumulating list of details that individually meant nothing and together meant something she didn't like. The escort detail she'd overheard about turned out to be real. She confirmed it by the simplest method available to her. She asked the duty roster clerk, a soft-spoken Valkyrie named Het who handled payroll and who had taken a liking to Mara after she'd helped him fix a translation error in a supply requisition that had been quietly costing the kitchen budget for months. Het didn't think anything of showing her the schedule. Captain Dorn had requisitioned 3 additional guards for what was logged as perimeter security, Princess Ilian's private wing, running every night from midnight to 4, for the past 6 weeks. That alone wasn't damning. Princes and princesses got extra security all the time, especially with succession tensions running as high as they currently were. What bothered Mara was that the additional guards weren't stationed at the entrances to the wing. She checked, twice, walking the corridor herself late at night under the unremarkable pretext of bringing the princess water. The extra detail was stationed at the service stairwell, the one connecting the residential wing directly to the lower transport bay where supply vehicles and, occasionally, unmarked diplomatic transports came and went without passing through the main palace checkpoints. It was the kind of detail that made sense if you were guarding against an intrusion. It made even more sense if you were planning an extraction and wanted the route clear of witnesses. Mara told herself, again, that she was building a conspiracy out of overtime sheets and her own discomfort with a man who simply had an intense face. She had no proof of anything. She had a feeling, and feelings were not the kind of currency that moved anyone in a palace, least of all a king who had already lost one child to violence and trusted his captain of the guard with the life of the one he had left. What changed her mind, finally and completely, was the matter of the letter. It arrived for the princess through the diplomatic pouch, which meant it bypassed the household's normal mail handling and went directly to Captain Dorn's office for security screening before being delivered, a protocol established after the second assassination attempt and never questioned since. Mara only learned about it because the princess mentioned, lightly, almost forgetting she was speaking to staff and not a confidant, that she was still waiting on a reply from her mother's sister, the Duchess of the Outer Reach, regarding a visit the princess had been quietly planning for months. A visit, the princess admitted in a rare unguarded moment, that she hadn't told her father about, because the Duchess was the one relative who had openly opposed the current line of succession politics and the princess wanted, for once, to make a decision that wasn't filtered through the throne. Mara asked, carefully, when the last letter had come through. The princess said 3 weeks ago. Mara, who managed the princess's correspondence log as part of her duties, knew for a fact that no letter from the Duchess of the Outer Reach had been logged in 3 weeks. Either the Duchess had stopped writing entirely, which seemed unlikely given how often the princess mentioned looking forward to a reply, or the letters were being screened by Captain Dorn's office and never making it through. That night, Mara did something that could have ended her contract and possibly her freedom if she'd been caught. She volunteered to deliver the evening security log to the captain's office, a task normally handled by a junior guard, and while waiting for him to sign off on it, she let her eyes move across the surface of his desk the way she trained herself to read a room full of strangers back on Earth, fast, unobtrusive, cataloging rather than staring. She saw, among the routine paperwork, a sealed correspondence pouch bearing the wax crest of the outer reach, unopened, dated 11 days prior, sitting in a drawer that had been left open just enough for the edge of it to show. She saw a transport manifest with a departure window logged for the following week, destination redacted, authorization signature belonging to Captain Dorn himself, requiring no co-signature from the king's office, which Mara would later learn was an oversight in palace protocol that nobody had thought to close because nobody had ever imagined the captain of the guard would be the threat. She left the office having signed nothing, said nothing, touched nothing but the security log she'd been sent to deliver. Captain Dorn thanked her with the brisk indifference he extended to all staff and didn't look up from his desk as she left. He had no idea what she'd seen. He had no reason to suspect a maid would know what an unopened diplomatic pouch and a redacted transport manifest meant when placed side by side. Mara walked back to her quarters that night with her hands shaking, not from fear exactly, though there was fear in it, but from the particular vertigo of realizing that the thing you suspected was actually true, and that knowing it now made you responsible for it in a way that not knowing never had. She had no proof that would survive a Valkyrie court. She had no standing to accuse the most decorated officer in the royal guard of intercepting royal correspondence and planning to move the princess somewhere off the books. She had, instead, 18 months of contract, a brother back home whose treatment depended on her staying employed and unremarkable, and a princess 2 doors down who trusted the wrong man completely. She thought about walking away from it. She thought about it seriously, for almost an entire night, lying in the dark doing the math on what she owed this job versus what she owed a girl who talked to her about rain because nobody else would talk to her about anything that wasn't dangerous. By morning she had made her decision, and it was not the safe one. Mara's first problem was that she had no one to tell. The king's office answered to the king, but she had no access to the king and no proof that would survive being laughed out of a throne room by a man whose captain of the guard had earned his trust through a documented act of heroism. The household steward answered, indirectly, to Captain Dorn, since palace security oversaw all senior staff appointments. Even Het, kind as he was a Valkyrie subject with a Valkyrie subject's instinctive deference to a decorated officer, and asking him to act on the unverified suspicions of a human maid would likely get them both reassigned somewhere far less useful before the week was out. So Mara did the only thing that felt safe enough to attempt. She went to the princess directly, and she did it slowly, the way you'd approach a skittish animal, because she understood that what she was about to suggest would sound, to a girl raised on stories of Captain Dorn's heroism, like an accusation of betrayal against the one person standing between her and a throne full of enemies. She chose an evening when the princess was tired and unguarded, the wardrobe inventory long finished, the two of them sitting in the study with cooling tea neither of them was drinking. Mara asked, with the careful neutrality of someone defusing something, whether the princess had heard back from her aunt yet. The princess's face did something complicated. Hope, then the practiced suppression of hope, then a flicker of something that looked almost like embarrassment. No, she admitted. Nothing in over a month. She'd begun to wonder if her aunt had simply decided the visit was too politically risky and hadn't known how to say so. Mara said, choosing each word like she was diffusing something live, that she found that strange, because correspondence through the diplomatic pouch was supposed to be logged on arrival, and nothing had been logged. She watched the princess's expression shift from confusion to the beginning of alarm. She told her about the overtime sheets, the guard stationed at the service stairwell instead of the entrances, the unopened pouch with the outer reach crest she'd seen in a drawer that should have been empty. She did not say Captain Dorn's name as an accusation. She didn't have to. The princess got there on her own, and watching her get there was one of the harder things Mara had done in her life, because she watched a girl's entire architecture of safety collapse in real time, watched her reach for every alternative explanation, a clerical error, a security protocol Mara simply didn't understand, anything other than the conclusion that the man who'd saved her life once might be the reason she wouldn't survive to see 20. He carried me out of the East Colonnade with his own arms when the first bomb went off, the princess said, very quietly, like she was reciting evidence at her own trial. He took a fragment wound doing it. I saw the scar. I'm not saying that didn't happen, Mara said. I'm saying I don't know why a man who did that would also be sitting on your aunt's letters and clearing a transport route through the service bay that doesn't go past a single checkpoint. Maybe there's an explanation. I just think you deserve to know before you find out the hard way. The princess didn't sleep that night. Neither did Mara, who sat awake turning over every version of how badly this could go, including the very real possibility that the princess, frightened and unmoored, might confront the captain directly and hand him exactly the warning he needed to accelerate whatever he was planning. She didn't. To her credit, and Mara would think about this later as the moment she stopped seeing the princess as a job and started seeing her as someone worth the risk she was taking, Ilian did the harder, smarter thing. She said nothing to Captain Dorn. She continued her routine exactly as before, smiled at him with the same brittle correctness she always had, and spent the following 3 days doing what Mara realized, with something like awe, was actual investigative work of her own, using the access only a princess had, quietly reviewing the household ledger she was technically entitled to but had never bothered with before, cross-referencing guard rotations against the official security budget approved by her father's treasury. What she found, by the end of those 3 days, confirmed and deepened everything Mara had pieced together from overtime sheets and an open desk drawer. The transport scheduled for the following week wasn't logged anywhere in the official diplomatic calendar. It was being routed through a private account, one the princess recognized, with a slow, sick recognition, as belonging to House Threnville, a noble family whose patriarch had been quietly maneuvering for influence over the succession for years and who had, the princess now remembered with new clarity, hosted Captain Dorn at a private dinner only weeks before his sudden, generous reassignment to her personal detail. It wasn't an assassination plan, the princess realized, turning it over with Mara late into the night. It was worse, in its way, because it was patient. They didn't need her dead. A princess held quietly somewhere off the official record, available to be produced or denied depending on how the succession crisis played out, was infinitely more useful to House Threnville than a martyr. She could be leverage. She could be a hostage to a treaty. She could be whatever the situation required, for as long as it took, and no one would even know to look for her, because the man responsible for finding her was the man who had taken her. I trusted him, the princess said, and there was no brittleness in it now, just a flat, exhausted grief. Everyone told me to trust him. You don't have to trust me either, Mara said. But I'm telling you what I saw, and I'm telling you we don't have much time. The transport was scheduled to depart in 4 days. Neither of them had any idea, yet, how they were going to stop it. The problem, as Mara saw it, wasn't proving that something was wrong. They had that, more or less, stitched together out of overtime sheets and an unlogged transport and a noble house with motive and opportunity. The problem was that the only people with the authority to act on that proof were either unreachable, like the king, or potentially compromised, like anyone in the security apparatus who answered to Captain Dorn. They needed someone outside the chain of command entirely, someone with enough standing to be heard and little enough connection to House Threnville or the captain to be trusted. Mara, lying awake running through everyone she'd encountered in 3 months at the palace, kept coming back to one name, Administrator Seneth, the anxious, thin-faced bureaucrat who had reassigned her contract on her very first day and who, Mara had noticed in the months since, occupied an odd position in the palace hierarchy, technically subordinate to the steward and the captain both, but answerable directly to the Office of Royal Audit, a body that existed specifically to investigate irregularities in palace spending and that, crucially, reported not to the captain or the steward but to the crown treasury, which answered only to the king. It was, Mara realized, turning the idea over, the one structural seam in the palace that Captain Dorn's authority didn't fully cover. Guard rotations were security business and therefore his. But overtime pay came out of the household budget, and household budget irregularities were Seneth's entire job. The princess was doubtful. Seneth, she pointed out, was a minor administrator with no real power, the kind of person whose entire career was built on not making waves. Asking him to flag a security irregularity involving the captain of the guard was asking him to risk everything for a human maid's suspicions and a princess who, until 4 days ago, had publicly trusted the man in question completely. Mara thought he might do it anyway, not because he was brave, exactly, but because she'd watched him for months handle every transaction in the household with a kind of fussy, anxious thoroughness that suggested a man who genuinely could not stand the idea of numbers not adding up. People like that, in her experience, could sometimes be moved less by courage than by an intolerable itch. She went to him alone, without the princess, because the princess showing up in his office would draw exactly the kind of attention they couldn't afford. She brought him the overtime sheets Het had shown her, framed not as an accusation but as a question. She'd noticed, she said, an unusual pattern in the night security details hours, and given that she handled some of the wardrobe and household accounts herself, she wondered if it was something the audit office should be aware of, purely as a matter of budget irregularity. Seneth, to his credit, did not dismiss her. He pulled the records himself, cross-referenced them against the approved security budget, and went very pale in a way that told Mara everything she needed to know about how seriously he took discrepancies in numbers that were supposed to balance. He asked, carefully, whether she had any other documentation. Mara, who had spent the previous night writing out, from memory, everything she'd seen in Captain Dorn's office, the transport manifest, the unopened pouch, the redacted destination, gave him as much detail as she dared without revealing that she'd been in his office under false pretenses to see it. It was enough. Seneth, it turned out, had his own quiet suspicions about House Threnville, having flagged an unusual pattern of payments from a Threnville-linked account to a palace transport contractor months earlier, a pattern he'd noted in a routine audit and then watched mysteriously fail to generate any follow-up inquiry from the security office, an oversight he'd assumed at the time was simple bureaucratic inertia and now, with Mara's information laid alongside it, looked considerably less innocent. He agreed to take it to the Crown Treasury Auditor General, a woman named Corveth Pell who had, by reputation, no patience for palace politics and no loyalty to anyone but the ledger. It would take time, Seneth warned, possibly more time than they had. Audits did not move quickly even when they were urgent, and an audit that implicated the captain of the guard would move with extreme caution, because if it was wrong, the political fallout would land on everyone who touched it. 4 days had become 3 by the time Seneth made contact with the Auditor General's office. Mara understood, with a sinking, practical clarity, that bureaucracy was not going to save the princess in time. It might eventually expose Captain Dorn. It would not stop a transport scheduled to leave in 72 hours. Which meant that whatever happened next, the two of them, a maid and a princess with no army and no proof a court would accept, were going to have to handle it themselves. The princess, when Mara told her this, did not flinch the way Mara expected. She sat very still for a long moment, and then she said something that surprised them both with how steady it sounded. Then we don't wait for someone to believe us. We make it impossible for them not to. Mara didn't yet know what that meant. But for the first time since the night she'd seen the unopened pouch, she let herself believe they had a chance. What the princess meant, it turned out, was evidence that didn't depend on anyone's word. Audits and overtime sheets could be argued with. A recording could not. The idea came from the princess herself, who pointed out something Mara, for all her careful observation, had missed entirely: every transport authorization in the palace, including the unlogged one Mara had seen on Captain Dorn's desk, required a final verification call to the transport bay's dispatch office, a standard protocol meant to confirm departure windows against live air traffic in the capital's restricted airspace. That call was, by palace regulation, automatically logged and time-stamped by the dispatch office's own systems, a system that fell under neither the captain's authority nor House Threnville's reach, because air traffic coordination answered to the Planetary Transit Authority, a civilian body entirely outside palace politics. If they could get Captain Dorn to make that call referencing the princess by name and the unlogged destination, the recording would exist somewhere a court could subpoena it, regardless of who controlled the palace's internal records. The difficulty was that they had no way to make him say anything. He wasn't going to confess to a maid or confide his plans to a princess he was actively working to isolate. What they needed was a reason for him to discuss the operational details of the transport plainly enough, on a channel he didn't know was being scrutinized, to put it on record. Mara's plan, when she proposed it, made the princess go quiet for a long moment before she agreed to it, because it required Ilian to do the one thing every instinct in her had been trained against: act helpless. The princess would tell Captain Dorn, in a quiet, private conversation, that she'd grown anxious about the unrest surrounding the succession and wanted to know more about the security plans being made for her safety, framing it as a frightened girl seeking reassurance from the man she trusted rather than a princess asking pointed questions. It was, Mara knew, a cruel thing to ask of someone who had spent 18 years being taught that showing fear was a liability. But fear was exactly what would make Captain Dorn comfortable enough to explain himself in detail, because a frightened, compliant princess asking for reassurance was precisely the version of her he needed for his plan to work. It worked better, and worse, than either of them expected. The princess went to him the following evening, and Mara, positioned in the corridor outside under the unremarkable pretext of returning laundered uniforms to the guards' anteroom, listened through a door left deliberately ajar as Captain Dorn, with the practiced gentleness of a man comforting a child, explained that there had been credible threats against her, that for her own safety she would be moved to a secure location outside the palace within the week, that the transport would depart from the lower bay specifically because it avoided the checkpoints where threats were most likely to be staged, and that she should trust him, as she always had, to keep her safe. He never said House Threnville. He never said the destination was anything other than a secure undisclosed location for her protection. He was, Mara realized listening through the door with her heart slamming against her ribs, very good at this, careful and plausible in exactly the way that had made him the most trusted man in the palace. But he did say the date. He did say the departure window. And later that night, when the princess, still playing her part, expressed a tremulous worry about whether the dispatch office would even clear an unscheduled transport on such short notice, Captain Dorn, eager to reassure her further, told her not to worry, that he would personally place the verification call himself the following morning to confirm the window, and that everything was already arranged. Mara spent the next 12 hours in a state of controlled panic, working out how to get access to a verification log she had no legitimate reason to see. The answer, when it came, was Seneth again, whose audit authority, it turned out, technically extended to reviewing any transport cost charged against palace accounts, including the verification logs that justified them. When Mara explained, carefully, vaguely, that she believed an unauthorized transport was about to be confirmed through dispatch and that the log of that call would matter enormously to his audit, Seneth didn't ask the questions he probably should have. He simply said he would request the log the moment it existed, citing his ongoing review, a request well within his authority and unlikely to draw suspicion from anyone, since audit requests for transport records were, by his own account, one of the most boring and routine things he did. The call happened the next morning. Captain Dorn, confirming the departure window with dispatch, referenced the princess by name, the destination coordinates, which Seneth would later confirm matched a private Threnville estate well outside the capital's jurisdiction, and the route through the lower bay, all of it captured, time-stamped, and stored on a civilian system he had no authority to alter. By that afternoon, Seneth had the recording. By that evening, he had taken it, along with the overtime sheets and the payment pattern from House Threnville, directly to Auditor General Corvith Pell, bypassing every layer of palace hierarchy that might have buried it. The transport was still scheduled to depart in 48 hours. They had their proof. They still didn't know if it would arrive in time to matter. Auditor General Corvith Pell, Mara would learn afterward, was not a woman who moved quickly under normal circumstances, and the circumstances Seneth brought to her were anything but normal. A recording implicating the captain of the guard in an unauthorized transport of the princess, tied to suspicious payments from a noble house actively maneuvering for influence over the succession, was not the kind of thing she could act on alone. It required the Crown Treasury's authorization to escalate, which required, in turn, someone willing to put their name on a request that would either expose a conspiracy against the throne or end the careers of everyone who touched it if they were wrong. Pell, to her enormous credit, decided she would rather be wrong and accountable than right and silent. But the machinery of getting an audience with the king himself, bypassing the captain who controlled access to the royal wing, took the better part of a day. Mara and the princess didn't know if they had. They spent that day doing the only thing they could, pretending nothing had changed. The princess continued her routine with the same brittle composure Mara had first met her with, 3 months and what felt like a lifetime ago, smiling at Captain Dorn, thanking him for his diligence, giving no sign that she had spent the previous night listening to her own kidnapping being arranged in the next room with the door left open. Mara understood, watching her, that this was its own kind of courage, harder in some ways than the night they'd spent piecing together overtime sheets, because it required performing trust for a man who had already decided her life was a piece to be moved on someone else's board. It was Het, of all people, who gave them the warning that the timeline had moved. He found Mara in the lower corridor the following morning, anxious and apologetic, to tell her that the captain had requested the transport be moved up, departing that night instead of the following evening, citing an unspecified increase in threat assessment. Mara understood immediately what that meant. Either Captain Dorn had grown suspicious that something was being investigated, or House Threnville had simply decided not to wait any longer. Either way, the Auditor General, the careful machinery of bureaucratic justice that Seneth had set in motion, was not going to move fast enough. She went to the princess with the news, and for the first time since the whole thing began, she watched Ilian's composure genuinely crack, not into fear exactly, but into the cold calculation of someone realizing that the people meant to protect her could not be relied upon to arrive in time, and that whatever happened next would have to happen because the two of them made it happen. If the transport leaves tonight, the princess said slowly, we don't get a second chance to stop it quietly. Mara had spent 3 months learning the palace's rhythms in the unglamorous way maids learn things, through laundry schedules and kitchen gossip and the small, unconsidered movements of people who didn't think she was paying attention. She knew, for instance, that the lower transport bay's outer doors operated on a manual override that required physical authorization at a control panel, installed years earlier after an automated system failure had once trapped a supply convoy inside during a power fluctuation, a redundancy nobody had bothered to remove because nobody had imagined needing it for anything but routine maintenance. She knew, too, that the override required 2 separate authorizations from 2 different security clearances, a deliberate safeguard against any single guard locking the bay unilaterally. The princess had one of those clearances, by virtue of her royal status, even if she'd never used it. The other belonged, ordinarily, to the bay's duty officer, a Valkyrie named Corin Vosk who Mara had spoken to exactly twice, both times about a delayed supply shipment, and who had struck her as exactly the kind of person who took procedure seriously enough to be moved by a princess showing up in person with a direct, urgent order. It was a thin plan, built on the hope that a low-ranking duty officer would honor a direct royal command over a captain's authorization, that Pell's audit would reach the king before House Threnville's people reached the princess, and that 2 women with no military training and no weapons could stall an operation run by the most decorated officer in the royal guard for long enough to matter. It was also, as far as either of them could see, the only plan they had. That night, as the palace settled into its evening routine and Captain Dorn's extra detail took up their positions at the service stairwell exactly as they had for 6 weeks, Princess Ilian Voskeravet and her human maid walked together, quietly, deliberately, toward the lower transport bay, carrying nothing but a recording neither of them could prove had reached anyone who mattered, and the thin, desperate hope that it had. Corin Vosk was checking a manifest against a transport ledger when the princess walked into the duty office unannounced, and Mara watched him go through the same sequence of confusion every Valkyrie staffer seemed to experience upon realizing royalty had appeared somewhere it had no logged reason to be. He straightened, began the formal greeting palace protocol required, and got perhaps 3 words into it before the princess cut him off and told him, flatly, that the transport scheduled to depart from his bay that night was unauthorized, that it involved her own unlawful removal from the palace, and that she required him, as duty officer, to refuse the captain's authorization and lock the bay under manual override. It was, Mara would think later, an extraordinary thing to watch, the princess laying out the situation not as a frightened girl asking for help but as the heir she actually was, citing her own clearance, citing palace law regarding unauthorized transport of royal persons, citing the 2 authorization safeguard built precisely for situations like this one. Vosk, to his credit, did not simply refuse out of deference to a captain he'd worked under for years. He hesitated, visibly torn, and asked, reasonably, what proof she had. This was the moment Mara had been bracing for since they'd left the residential wing, the moment where a recording sitting somewhere in an Auditor General's office, unconfirmed and unreachable, was not going to be enough to convince a duty officer to defy the most powerful man in palace security. She had no backup plan beyond this. Neither did the princess. They were standing in a transport bay with a man who held the literal authorization that would either trap them there for Captain Dorn to find or buy them the time they needed, and all they had was the truth, told as clearly and urgently as either of them could manage. It was, in the end, not the recording that moved him. It was Mara, stepping forward, who told him plainly that she was the one who'd seen the unopened letters, the redacted manifest, who'd stood outside a door and listened to a man she'd once been told to trust explain to a frightened girl exactly how he planned to disappear her, and that whatever happened to her afterward for saying so, she would rather say it than stay quiet and watch it happen. There was something in the bluntness of a human maid with nothing to gain and everything to lose, risking her contract, her safety, and possibly her freedom to say it to his face, that did what an institutional recording alone could not. Vosk locked the bay. Captain Dorn arrived 11 minutes later, alone, having been informed by one of his own guards that the princess had been seen heading toward the lower levels unescorted. Mara would remember, for the rest of her life, the precise moment his expression shifted from professional concern to something colder when he saw the three of them standing in the locked bay, and understood, instantly and completely, that whatever he'd planned had already gone wrong. He tried, briefly, to maintain the fiction, ordering Vosk to release the override, citing his authority, his rank, the security threat he claimed justified the transport. Vosk, badge of office trembling slightly in his hand, refused, citing the princess's counter-authorization and the too clear and safeguard that even a captain couldn't override alone. What ended it, finally, was not anything Mara or the princess did. It was the arrival, 20 minutes later, of a small detachment from the Crown Treasury's own security office, dispatched not by Captain Dorn's chain of command but directly by Auditor General Pell, who had reached the king 2 hours earlier than anyone in the lower bay knew. The dispatch recording and the payment trail from House Threnville laid out plainly enough that the king had ordered Captain Dorn detained on the spot, the order simply taking time to physically reach the lower levels. Through channels that didn't run through the captain himself. Mara watched Reskull Dorn's face in the moment he understood the king already knew, watched the careful, practiced confidence drain out of him entirely, replaced by something that looked, for just a second, almost like relief, the exhausted relief of a man who had been holding a single enormous lie together for weeks and could finally stop. He didn't resist. He let them take him without another word, and the bay went very quiet once he was gone, the kind of silence that comes after something has been held so tightly for so long that its absence feels like its own kind of weight. The investigation that followed confirmed everything Mara had pieced together from overtime sheets and an open drawer, and considerably more besides. House Threnville's patriarch was arrested within the week. Captain Dorn's heroism in the East Colonnade, it turned out, had been real, but his loyalty had been purchased sometime after, in the slow, patient way these things often happened, through debts and promises that had nothing to do with the scar he carried. Princess Ilian never went back to treating her staff as appliances. She didn't make a public spectacle of what Mara had done, understanding instinctively that Mara wanted no part of being turned into a court story, but she extended Mara's contract personally, doubled her wages without being asked, and made a point, every evening she could manage it, of sitting across from her maid in the study and talking about nothing that mattered, because she had learned, in the worst possible way, that nothing mattering was the rarest and most valuable thing a person in her position could have. Mara stayed the full 18 months, and then 6 more after that, not because the contract required it, but because somewhere in the overtime sheets and the locked transport bay, a maid who'd never wanted the job and a princess who'd never been allowed to trust anyone had built something neither of them had a word for, except that it had kept one of them alive, and that seemed, to both of them, more than enough reason to keep it.